All right, I guess it's time to get started. Hi everybody, welcome to a journey to Mission ISS. I'm Laird Malamed. I am the GM of our Seattle office and also oversee our educational research projects. Thank you very, very much for coming. Let me briefly introduce you to our panel, and then we'll talk a little bit about why we're here and why we're so excited. If you've been at Keynote today and following along, you've been actually seeing a lot of Mission ISS footage, and we'll talk about how that came to be, and then a little bit like, what do we think about it as a successful project? What do we think its impact can be? On our panel here, we have at the far end, we have Ben Grossmann, who is the co-founder of Magnopus. And everyone's going to introduce themselves after I do a little further intro, but just so you know, everyone's up here. We have our former astronaut, or cosmonaut, since she went with the Russian program from Korea, Soyeon. And then from the European Space Agency, so we're really representing a global perspective here, I hope, because the International Space Station is, after all, the International Space Station. Andrea Conigli. How'd I do?
That was good.
That was pretty good. Okay, all right. You see, I could tell that was only pretty good. But and so who's in charge of the video and photography specialties, especially as it relates to bringing space back down to the Earth. So a little bit of background. So Mission ISS came about. The idea started a couple years ago. David Knight brought to me the idea of thinking that we could actually do some stuff with the space station, and introduced us to Ben, to Amresh. I know he's in the audience here somewhere. I can't see anybody, but he's out here. There he is. And we put together the project, and with the help of the Oculus Studios team, so Colum, Kevin, Tina, Isabel, we got this project done, and it launched in early part of this year. So the goal was really, as you'll see in this trailer I'll play here in a second, was really, as both I think Zuck and Jason Rubin said today, like, in this room, we have the only person at Oculus Connect who can say they've been to the station. So I'll just ask, how many people have been to the International Space Station? You're supposed to raise your hand. Yeah. There you go. So the most of us will never go. There was a question about the White House too, which was, by the way, we were also Emmy nominated, but when you lose to President Obama, I don't feel so bad. So that's okay. Anyway, so that's how the idea came about. It's out for Rift. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So if you haven't seen it, let's just play the 1-minute trailer, which should play here, hopefully. If I hit the right button. Or not. It worked in testing. Nothing. Okay. We'll do it manually.
Tech support is running in.
Oh, I see. We got out of presentation mode, I think.
Yeah.
There we go.
Only a handful of people know what it's like to be an astronaut. To float freely in orbit, unbound by gravity. To work, learn, and live in space. You can be one of them. You'll never look at the Earth the same way again.
Yeah, pretty cool what the team did. Let me go back to the slide here until we do the slide. So if you haven't played the experience, you can go onto the station, you navigate it, there are missions, there are science experiments you can do, which are modeled on experiments that have actually done on station. We have videos with a number of astronauts. You can dock the Dragon capsule, and you can do a spacewalk. All things that, if you have any interest in space, you'll want to do. We've actually, from an educational point of view, this is This content actually is in nearly 100 libraries in California. We have public access VR in California that our team has put together. Our Tech Start team at Facebook has 500 Rift setups in Arkansas high schools, almost every high school in Arkansas. This is down there. And of course, it's available on the store. It's for free. Really the idea of course, bringing these experiences to as many people as possible, and these things that can't just be done. You can't go sign up for a space flight unless you're like super wealthy. And I don't even know if that's even possible anymore. So our theme today, and what we'll talk about on the panel, right, is this is a real world experience that we've recreated in VR. And the questions are like, how far do you go to be real world and still be something that's entertaining, educational, something accessible, right? You can see going to space is very complicated, took a long time to train, right, to get there, and yet we put you in there immediately, and how do you have that context? So let me let everybody do a bit of an intro. So Andrea, why don't you start a little bit and talk a little bit about your background, and let me get to your slides here. Skip that again and hand this over to you. Yeah. It's kind of the work that you're doing at ESA, how it relates to this.
Sure. I've been working for ESA for about 10 years or a bit more, and the idea is that I've been involved from the beginning into, as Laird said at the beginning, bringing space to Earth. I put this photo. This is our building. This is human space flight at ESA. Just to give you an idea of the size of the business here, it's much smaller than NASA. Still, in this building, we host a bit less than 200 people, I think. This is in the Netherlands. This is the Human Space Flight, say, Directorate. And then we have, obviously, the Astronaut Center in Cologne. So only, in total, probably, we have 300 people working for Human Space Flight. Still, we get to do a lot of business. We have partnerships with NASA, Orion, Capsule is going to be a coordinated project between the two agencies. And we do ExoMars, missions to Mars. We do astronauts to the space station. And small business, but still it is quite effective. And my job there is actually to provide imagery and contents that are at the forefront of technology and make it popular. This is our exhibition center, just try it. And over the years, we went exploring different technologies to bring 3D to the audiences on ground. So still the idea of bringing space to ground. Bottom left, you see our first 3D camera that we sent on board. We actually manufactured this film Nikon 3D camera to take special photos you would be able to watch once we downloaded the rolls back on ground. And then we went on with 2 generations of 3D cameras, 3D camcorders specifically designed for space. That's an example of one of our shows. And then obviously, eventually, Panasonic made this beautiful full HD camcorder that was eventually uploaded to space station. And then from that point on, it was a totally different ballgame. Another thing that we explored way before Street View from Google did recently, we mapped the whole station with 360 photos, and we created this virtual tour. You could navigate the station and go and click on the interesting points and get these, pieces of video that would further explain what each facility would do and so on, and mostly narrated by our astronauts. And here in the new version, the agreement has been finalized. These 360 images will be combined with the VR experience of Mission ISS to provide, so you can compare what it is compared to reality.
That's breaking news. There you go. He's just going to get all this footage from European Space Agency and put it into the project.
And then what do we want to do with VR now? There's a few activities related to astronaut training. These are all studies. We're actually trying to frame exactly the problem. And one is to use VR for enhanced understanding when you're manipulating using a robotic manipulator, which now we only use 2 joysticks and 3 screens. But obviously, if you had a VR viewer, you can turn around and look for different perspectives and so on. Another application is for our astronaut training activities. This is a geological training activity that the astronauts do. What they want to do, they want to put 360 cameras on top of the astronauts' heads and have the geologists and scientists live, being somewhere else in a control room, being able to scrutinize and analyze the terrain around them without having to ask them to turn their head in one or that direction. And then obviously, we're using these systems also to involve astronauts in the early design phases of potential moon bases. So the astronauts can do some sort of usability tests and provide feedback from the very early stages of the design of these facilities. And I think I'm done.
Cool. All right.
I was a bit long.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to ISS? No Mission ISS, just ISS.
It's a kind of honor to be here as the only person who has been in IS before now. Yeah, I went to the ISS 2008 April as the representative of my country, Republic of Korea. It's already almost 10 years ago. I cannot believe it. It's almost like yesterday. And brief introduction about the astronaut program of Korea. We didn't have a human space exploration program in Korea. Even now, we don't have. But Korean people really, really want to make at least one astronaut. So they opened to the application for whole Korean general public. If you are 19 years older or healthy enough, Korean citizenship holder, then you can apply. So finally, we have a 36,000 candidate over there. I was one of them. And then we screening out and then pretty much last bottom things for final 2 out of the 10. It was a televised TV show like American Idol style things. And my mom was so excited because I was on the TV. She doesn't care about what's going on. Oh, yeah, my daughter is on the TV and she take a photo of the TV and then share her friends. And that was really kind of wonderful time to make my friends and family happy. And then, not only for an astronaut, but also for an experiment, they had a huge competition. All the engineering schools and research institution and company, they proposed their own experiment, and we picked the 18 different kinds of experiment for fair game, and all different field, all different kind of track thing. And for bottom one is from the science textbook, from the primary school, middle school, and high school kind of things for the education purpose. So first Korean astronaut, not only for the ambassador of the Korean space program, but also inspirer of the STEM field, and also should be a science teacher for the kids. So it's the kind of multi roles I should take up because it's the first. And of course, personally, I really want to enjoy my time during the 11 days only, so busy, but whenever I have a time, I try to do meditation like Chinese Master Shifu. You can see the photo, and then I played Taekwondo, always dreamed to be a Jackie Chan, to kick the badass. So I tried to the flying kick, even if I've never tried on the ground. That was really kind of fun to be in a zero gravity. And hopefully, how can I play this? Yeah.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among these stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, darling, kiss me. Feel my heart's song and let me sing forevermore. You are all I long for, all I worship and adore. And in other words, please be true. In other words, I love you.
Yeah. It is the last night of my flight, and we had some kind of like welfare party because some of the astronauts already spent 6 months over there. They should go down, and some of the astronauts come up with me, and then they should stay next 6 months. So we have a really small party together. And unfortunately, we don't have a Russian segment inside of the Mission ISS yet, but I really, really want to help Oculus to put in the Russian segment inside of the Mission ISS.
That is not breaking news.
Yeah, I really, because most of the time I spend in the Russian segment, and you could hear the sounds, boo. That's the real sounds from space because always fan running. So a lot of the tourists who paid $30-20 million to go up there, they always complain about the sounds. But most of the people like me, scientists or pilot, we know that sounds kind of help us to survive because that is a life support thing. So that is an interesting point of view. But most of the millionaires, they working in a small little quiet office, so they are not accustomed to have that fan sounds. But I believe all you guys are already accustomed to have your computer fan sounds, and I love that because that is the sounds of life. And astronauts are not only representative of their own country, but also we really want to be a representative of the whole Earth. What if alien come down? Maybe all the astronauts in the space station would meet first. Yeah, kidding. But yeah, we really want to help and promote and support peaceful Earth, even if right now we don't have a good situation around the whole country. And maybe if we have a real-time view of Earth in a Mission ISS in the future, because we really want to make it, you would have see this sad photo or sad kind of situation through the Mission ISS. Why I call it sad? Because it is a photo of the Korean Peninsula. It's a pretty much bright place is South Korea, and total dark place is North Korea. A little bit of the light point is the Pyongyang, capital city only. So whenever you look down to the Earth, especially at dark night, you could figure out clear border between the rich country and poor country because they don't have electricity, they don't have a good grid. So all the astronauts feel so sad because 1980, 1970, most of the astronauts, right after their flight, whenever they have a press conference, they said, whole globe is one. We couldn't see any border at all, so it's really peaceful. But nowadays, as an astronaut who went to the space station recently, we couldn't say that because we could see the border distinctively. So that's really sad. And not only as an astronaut, but also all you developers and engineers, I think we should think about how we can help this situation in the future. So even if it's not the UN meeting or panel thing, I really want to emphasize this part. And that's all I have to share about my flight. If you have more things, you can catch me after this panel. I have a lot of things to talk.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. And some stuff will come up, I think, as we go through the questions. Ben, talk a little bit about Magnopus and your background.
As the least interesting person on this panel, it is my honor to speak briefly. My name is Ben Grossmann. I'm the co-founder of an experience company in Los Angeles called Magnopus. And we've been very fortunate over the last 4 years to work on Mission ISS especially, but in today's keynote, we also contributed to the Coco Pixar experience, the Blade Runner experience that you see out there, and a few other things we're cooking up in the lab. Some of what got us excited about Mission ISS in the beginning was that many of the people in the company came from the movie business where we worked in visual effects. And so we created spectacles and we had all these amazing worlds that we would create, and then we would chop them all up into tiny little rectangles and put them in movie theaters or put them on television. And that kind of was sad because we created worlds that people could explore, but only we could explore them. And so we left the movie business to go into virtual reality right about the same time Oculus was getting out of Kickstarter. And we said, we want to make experiences people can be inside. So you can be in the movie, but it's not a movie anymore. And it's not necessarily storytelling, it's more story experiencing, and you're creating it. And so that's why we got into what we're up to, and I'll just drop it at that because there's so much more interesting things happening over here.
No, well, thank you. And actually, when I went to visit Ben, he said, if you look at the lobby of my building carefully, you'll see a set from Star Trek Into Darkness. So that's a Pokemon hunt you guys can do if you can figure it all out, because they worked on the visual effects for that. So let me ask a few questions here, and we'll have some debate here and discussion, and then we'll open it up. Obviously, I'm sure there's people who have lots of questions. We want to get to those, as many as possible. Andrea, working in the area you have in terms of bringing space through visual imagery to both the astronauts in training and to the public, you showed the shot of the visitor center, which I've threatened to visit next time I'm in Europe. Where do you see VR in this, in terms of these experiences, both Mission ISS and others? Is it a continuation? Is it something separate? How do you personally, and maybe Isa, if you can speak, on behalf of the organization, see VR in this?
VR is the natural step forward in terms of PR, so entertaining people, bringing space to Earth, to the general public. Nobody's impressed by 3D anymore. We used to have these 3D models of space station back in the times where the first modules of space station were just put in orbit, and people were absolutely amazed by these 3D shows they would just see in a rectangle in front of them. And now nobody is really impressed with that anymore. Everybody has 3D at home, right? And VR, I think, not only is the natural step forward, but also it's something that people can have at their own place. And now I see the Gear VR Mission ISS experience is also a way to further enlarge the audience, I believe, and that is really quite something in terms of PR. On the other hand, it becomes also an interesting tool, a working tool. Again, helping to design new ideas for moon bases and stuff, but also having an immersive, really way to train for situations that you couldn't be possibly trained otherwise. Like NASA's been using VR for training for EVAs for ages now. And now we can familiarize our astronauts with the station before flight. And there's a lot of tricky situations you end up, on space station, and stories of astronauts confirm that. You get lost. You seriously get lost because you end up working in an upside down sort of setting, and then come back into the other modules. Suddenly you don't know where your coordinates are. And that helps quite a bit. And there's a lot of other terrains just ready to be explored, I believe, yeah.
So I think you're talking about partly also a very realistic point of view. So Ben, let me toss it over to you, right? You had to struggle with this, and the team had to struggle with how realistic to make this simulation, as you just mentioned. Right, Scott Kelly actually, who has the U.S. record, I think, for continuous spaceflight, not the U.S. record anymore because he was just passed. He used the experience, and I think Amresh, you told us that he said he got lost just like on the space station, and it was like, is that good news? Doesn't sound very fun. Ben, what were some of the challenges you guys looked at in bringing this into an experience that was meant to be enjoyed by many people?
It's particularly interesting because most of our previous work had been in the movie business. And in the movie business, in order to make something feel real to an audience, you pack in detail. So you get obsessed about like all these tiny little details off in the corner that no one's ever going to see, and you're going to crush them in color correction. And then that somehow that impresses upon people the spectacle and the realism of what they're experiencing. And so when we were first tackling the challenge of taking something I don't think there's any single object in the world that's probably as complex as the International Space Station is, and try to represent that in virtual reality, which in a movie business, we can render one frame in like 48 hours. And in VR, we have to render like 90 in sub-milliseconds. I mean, you have to render each one in sub-milliseconds. So you get into this situation where you go like, well, what do? We have to throw out all this information that's not relevant, which means that you have to go through and prioritize the things in the International Space Station that are visually important. And the irony is that if you were to compare the images from ESA of the 360 that were captured inside the space station and some of the test footage that we shot in 360 in the actual space station to what we've represented in Mission ISS, you go, oh my God, there's like so much missing. There's all these details missing. But then we put a lot of astronauts through it and said, tell us how you feel. Like, what do you remember? Like, what do you recollect from this experience? And they go, oh, it's so accurate, it's so amazing, and it's exactly like I remember it. And you're like, if I could show you a picture of what you actually remember compared to what you're actually experiencing, they're totally different planets, but they're in the right place, they do the right things. And here's what we learned from that. And this we take away from VR, and this is something we could never have gotten in the movie business. In the movie business, because you're just sitting like a blob on your couch, watching the movie, we're throwing information at you to keep your attention so that your brain just keeps processing information so it doesn't have time to think about the totally bogus storyline that we've shoved down your throat. And in VR, we've given you control and interactivity. And so now you can touch things, you can play with things, you can move yourself around, and your brain now prioritizes that interactivity more than it prioritizes the detail and little nuances of this, that, and some other stuff. So giving people interactivity and a sense of presence, it's kind of like if believability is a bucket. In visual effects for movies, we got to keep tossing stuff into that bucket. It's got to be everything it can possibly be. Camera shake, lens flares, just throw it all in there so we can get to that top so people go, I bought it, it was totally real. But in VR, you start out with that bucket and you go, here's interactivity, boom, there's barely any need to do much more. Okay, here's a little bit of quality, boom, all right, here's some performance and here's some educational stuff. And now the bucket is full and we haven't had to obsess over quality. Now, obsessing over quality is kind of a pastime of ours, so we really tried to put in these little nuances. So like when Scott did his version of the experience, his comments were, I used a Sharpie to leave my name on this part of the wall and it's not there. All right, well, we can take care of that. You know, there was a mission patch over here that should be there that isn't there. So we can put in those details that, like memories, are what you took away from the experience, and your brain just filtered out all the things that weren't relevant and remembered only the things that were important to you. So we've been trying to put in the experiences that are important to people who have never been there, and enough traces of the experiences of the people who have been there. And so we were fortunate to put a couple astronauts who had never been there, but had been to space, into the experience. Some of them were shuttle commanders, or they worked on the Hubble repair mission, and they got into the space station and they were like, I've always wanted to go to the space station. It's like, you've been to space, so you're really close. But they go like, oh, this is what it's like, you know? This is really interesting and amazing, and getting disoriented and turning around. It's super fun stuff, but all that detail is interesting, but not necessarily relevant when you give people the sense of being there. And Soyeon, you were saying that when you were going through the experience, the feeling of weightlessness and moving through the station was...
Yeah, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, right. And when I tried the Mission ISS, I feel totally dizzy after 30 minutes and almost like throw up, exactly like when I arrived in ISS.
I was wondering again if this was a compliment. It was just like being in Mission ISS, being on the space station.
I paled, and several Oculus people was asking me, are you okay? And I think so. So it was quite real, and then most of that, and inertia, even if I didn't thrust at all, but I keep moving, that's really real, and then I was so surprised. And then I'm also lost in the middle of time, and where I am. Exactly I did in space station also. So that was really incredible. And you know what, all the astronauts, we know that our job is a little different from being an astronaut. Is our lifetime job is sharing the story we experience. And then even if nobody assigned us, all astronauts, we knew that. That's our job for whole life. And some of the astronauts has a really, really hard time to explain how I feel, what I see, how it looks like. And I even see that some press conference, some astronaut was so upset about all the detailed question, and he said that if you really want to hear, you should send journalists to the space station. I'm not good at that. So, but when I see the Mission ISS, oh my God, that can be kind of like good spokesperson of the old astronaut. We don't have to hardly explain how it feels, how it looks like. So I became a so huge fan of Mission ISS. Even if Oculus never paid anything, I keep marketing to all my friends. Anybody asking me how it looks like, you can try the Mission ISS. That's
She's our best spokesperson.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And to not make everyone think like, oh my gosh, we made something that is absolutely no one can use, which is not the case. Obviously, we put in a lot of navigation things. But I do want to actually show a video, and Ben, you can talk about it, that shows the reaction of someone, with the system. So
should I set it up at all?
Yeah, go ahead, please do.
So I got a phone call one day from a doctor in Los Angeles, and she said, I volunteer for hospice care, and hospice care is typically terminally ill patients. And she does children's hospice specifically, which is particularly difficult. And she said that these are, VR has this ability to transport people to places they can't go. But we can all go a lot more places than most people. And so this particular boy can't really go very many places. He's pretty much constrained, and most of his life will be lived in his home, more or less. And so she said, we go and we visit him, and we always sort of talk to him on very difficult conversations about like where he would go and what he would see and what things he is interested in. And she said, well, I was just there, and he talked about always wanting to go to space. And so she said, like, it would be really cool if we could do something. Her husband was a director, and he knew me, and he called me, and he said, like, can we do something here? It would be awesome. And I was like, are you kidding me? We can do this tomorrow. Like, we had the engineers build a mobile VR cart, and we put a VR-capable laptop on it, and we built a whole bunch of stuff, and we engineered a big thing, and we like rushed it over there to get the experience of Mission ISS so that the children in the hospice center could experience it. And being a director, the Claudio Fay, the gentleman who organized the whole thing, shot a little teaser video of it because he wants to do a longer documentary experiencing these people's journey. So we could just show you a minute or so of this video right now.
A big spaceship. You can't even see the sun. It's so bright. Yeah, I'm floating down.
Kevin has cystic fibrosis and diabetes because of the cystic fibrosis. He's also had a liver transplant, a G-tube, and a TPN.
I can't go outside and play because I get tired easily. But when I go in, I'm just like, yes. Finally. You can move anywhere and look wherever you want. You can see the whole wide world, seeing people that live there. And that's the best part. Just looking out. Sometimes when I go in there, I just forget about what I have in these conditions. But when you're up there, you feel like I go right into the sun. Normal, like, you feel, how do I say this? You feel like with no worries up there. I can't even express it. It feels like you just went on a rainbow and slide down on it. That's how cool it feels. That releases me. It's awesome.
We're on our final slide there, but we're not done. I'll go back to the very first one here so I got a panel set up here. So obviously very touching, and you saw other videos, I think probably similarly, showing travel and today's keynote and whatnot. And so, interestingly there, right, someone who's not spending a lot of time in VR, the locomotion things, the challenges, the details that are there or not there, like that's not what's being left. So to the panel then, how do we look at this or other things that we want to communicate in experiences? Where do we find that heart? Maybe Ben, you could start. We'll go back the other way. Like, how do you for our developers out here, where would you direct them to go look to find that sort of we're bringing a real world experience? Where's the center?
Well, it's like with any good story, you write 10 times more than you need, and then you delete everything until there's nothing left but the most important part, and then you concentrate on making that part amazing. And it was sort of the same thing with Mission ISS. Rather than really get into the nuances of like, if you use the glove box and you move this chemical and you put that thing into there and how does it mix and how does it do that, we stepped back and we said, what's the thing that most people on the International Space Station are moved by the most first? And we realized that it was probably just microgravity. It was the ability to float through the space station and learn how to do that. So we spent most of our time concentrating on the mechanics of translating so compellingly into your visual system the feeling of microgravity, so that even though you're still in world gravity, your mind forgets that as you go through the experience, and putting in just the right amount of disorientation, sometimes too much, but just the right amount of disorientation to make you feel butterflies and to get a little bit lost. And we actually had to step back. I mean, if we went too far and we all threw up, and then we wound it back a little bit, and we wanted to make a checkbox for throw up because it was cool. Like, we have inertia in the system right now, but what you probably don't notice is that the inertia doesn't allow you to tumble. And when we first did it, we turned on tumbling. So you like grab something and you push yourself off and you're like, oh, because you're spinning while you go. And we discovered that the human body is way more sensitive to rotational changes than it is translational changes regarding differences between the vestibular system and the visual system. And so we did lots of stuff like that, but really it was about then saying, okay, well now what's the other most interesting thing you could do? Let's do a spacewalk, let's use the Canadarm, let's do enough of these little interactivities to let people learn about what's going on there and not dive too much into the details. But I think that we use a very delete everything that isn't essential process and then concentrate on making that great. And that's probably the best way to get these first generations of experiences out so that people can connect with them. And if you get into the experience, you'll realize one probably critical thing. The Canadarm operation is insanely complicated, and we have oversimplified it to the point of being almost like people at NASA were just like, that is so pedestrian. And yet, when you go in there, you can spend 30 minutes and still mess it up constantly. It gets really hard, but if you actually do the real thing, it's like 2.5 hours. And so you have to compromise on some of those things just to make it approachable for people so that it doesn't become a frustrating experience where you just go like, yeah, I went in and I didn't really do much because it was just too overwhelming. You know, you got to give people that freedom.
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, you went for 11 days to the station, plus all the training and selection process. Obviously, you don't get to go do talks at schools and whatever for 11 days straight. So you obviously have to edit the best of, and so, if, stepping back, how do you, what's your process for, communicating what you want to communicate? I mean, obviously you did a little bit in your intro here.
You're right, and then I'm not only an astronaut, but also kind of educator in every level of the kids. It's especially really, really hard to inspire the kids to study math and science. Everybody knows that it's really boring and hard. But once you heard about a space, and then once you experience kind of this, and then they just keep questioning why. Because whenever I was in a physics class, and most of the students always ask me why we should study this complicated physics. But what if they questioning that thing during the Mission ISS or hearing the astronauts things, and when they see the inertia inside of the Mission ISS, why I'm keep moving even if I didn't thrust? And then it will be the good kind of ignition to them to study about the physics. And most of the time, not only in US, but also around all the globe, so many distractions, so we cannot be really good to inspire kids for the future technology and kind of thing. But those space always spectacular and fun and fantasy. So that would be the great starting for the little kids or even grown up. So I always use that. And then some kids always come to me, do you really love to study? Oh my God, I cannot do that anymore. And then how you can keep studying even if it's really torturing you. And I can talk about how beautiful the Earth is, how the rocket going, and do you know how fast space station is moving? Do you know, can you see the space station outside in the dark night with your own bare eyes? And then they change their eyesight, and it's shining, and then they love to hearing more, and then do you want this and this? How about to study about physics? How about to technology? So those, not only my experience and talk, but also Mission ISS, kind of like VR, always would help make them people think about to learn and study and physics and math, hopefully.
But you going in have that goal, right? Inspiring. So it starts somewhat with that as well.
Yeah, but it's not easy to be a standing kind of comedian or fun person every time. So those technology always help us to show that. That's because I bring always Fly Me to the Moon video, make them people's lay back and are ready to listen to a little more serious topics. Yeah.
Cool. And Andrea, looking at you showed us the render of a potential moon base that gets us excited about, mission moon base. But you guys are already conceptualizing and you're partnering with NASA on getting us back to the moon, I believe. And so, how if you were to bring that to VR, for the masses, what would that process be in terms of figuring out? I mean, obviously, we're not going to take the 3 days to get to the moon in VR. That's probably a little too much for people.
Yeah, we're actually brainstorming right now on what type of experience we can build now using VR in terms of depicting exploration scenarios. So step beyond, away from ISS. Our next plans with NASA are to go back to the moon in some way. We're already next year, there's an unmanned mission that will be circling the moon with the Orion capsule. Followed by a manned mission a couple of years later. These guys will circle the moon, will deliver the first component of the new deep space habitat. There will be a new space station orbiting around the moon in a highly elliptical orbit. And so we're trying to understand what type of experiences we can do now, exactly like we did at the times when space station was not up yet, to sort of bring minds and inspiration forward into the future. And we're thinking about collaborative scenarios. I was briefly talking to Ben before,
So you need to work with developers, right? You guys don't have an in-house development team?
Absolutely, we need a lot of help.
All right, there you heard developers. You can hit his card.
we need a lot of help, that's for sure.
Cool.
And yeah, on the other hand, I wanted to follow up on what Soyeon said about getting people inspired. If I think about ISS, it's getting harder and harder because a decade ago, people would get excited just looking at space footage. And nowadays, they expect you to deliver 4K space footage, as well as 3D, and now obviously VR is the new way. So that's the thing. There's a constant demand for renewal of the technologies you're offering to the kids and also to the adults, quite very much so. Yeah.
Cool. Well, one last little thing we do have an announcement. We kind of glossed over it quickly, but I'm going to toss it over to Ben. You saw in that video they built this cart and they rolled it in, and if you think about scalability of bringing these experiences, whether it be it to hospices or schools, not so good. So Ben, what are we going to do about that? And actually, 10th anniversary of the station.
It's what we've already done. We worked really hard to be able to get PC VR a little bit more portable and a little bit more mobile so that people could share it with people who didn't have easy access to have those things in their homes. But now, working with Oculus over the last few months, we are happy to announce that we have ported Mission ISS from PC VR to Gear VR. So it will be available on Gear VR on the anniversary of the International Space Station this November, which I believe is the 20th.
Yeah. All right. So that'll make it a lot easier to see it. But there was last question, and we'll take questions from the audience. I mean, but then there were challenges in terms of, especially about navigation, and controller, and input. Do you want to just talk briefly about how you solved that?
There's probably a lot of people in the room who are developers, and in case you haven't read the manual, the compute power between PC VR and mobile VR is slightly different. And so getting the entire International Space Station to still retain that memory or that emotional connection of what it felt like, but running on a phone was a little bit of a challenge. So we did quite a bit of optimization there, but I'm pretty amazed that it's still 3D. We didn't switch to 360 video. The intro is 360 video just because you couldn't move anyways in it before. So, but once you get into the experience, it's still a full 3D model. You can still navigate. In touch, we have 2 hands, but in Gear VR, we have 1 controller, and we don't have 6 degrees of freedom in that. We have 3, and so what we've done is we've come up with a system that allows you to use the similar thrust controls like you had on the outside of the space station in the touch version to navigate through the inside. But because we took away a little bit in order to get it to work on mobile, we added in some other cool stuff. So in touch, you weren't able to turn yourself while you traveled. You had 2-handed rotation, but now we're giving you the ability with the controller to twist your wrist to reorient yourself as you float through the station. You can also grab things still with the controller. You can still click and interact with the things. You can still do the Canada arm. It's kind of like doing the experience, but with 1 hand instead of 2. But getting it all optimized to run on the phone and still look pretty amazing. We're still putting the polishing touches on it, but it all works now. And it's actually, I think in the demo areas, there's still a couple of units, which is where you saw it, right?
Yeah,
so we have it on the floor out there, and it'll get better before we launch it because we still have a little bit of time. We're gonna squeeze everything we can into it. But yeah, it was interesting to take an experience that was designed for 2 hands and convert it to 1 controller. And I think that it's very similar to the touch. And I think it's going to open it up to millions more people on mobile and make it so much more accessible. Because that cart that we built for them, when we got all the parts down to the cheapest thing we could possibly do, it was still $2,700. But now we know that coming soon, Oculus will give us a headset at a much cheaper price point that will run Mission ISS with the same level of interactivity.